Hey there folks, Wrel here. Today we're going to be comparing the Pulsar LSW and the SVA-88, both of which are LMGs for the Vanu Sovereignty and available to the Heavy Assault class. We'll be breaking down their individual statistics and offering some advice on how to use them effectively, but I do want to get the too long didn't watch out of the way right off the bat. The Pulsar LSW is not a terrible weapon. In fact, it has some traits that can actually help newer players more than it will a veteran player. However, there's still only one real reason that you'd ever want to take the Pulsar LSW over the SVA-88, and that is to say, the price tag. Or I guess if you ever need something new to put an Araxian metal on. But the Pulsar LSW will run you 100 certs or 250 station cash, whereas the SVA-88 costs 500 certs or 700 station cash. If you really can't handle the default Orion and you need something with maybe a little bit more range on top of those 25 extra rounds, then the Pulsar LSW is there at a low cost. But in every practical sense, the SVA-88 is objectively superior to the Pulsar LSW for reasons that we're going to talk about during the episode. That being said, both the Pulsar LSW and the SVA-88 deal 143 damage up to 10 meters, and then drop off to 125 damage at 65 meters. With that damage model, you're looking at 7 shots to kill up to around 11 meters, and 8 shots to kill anywhere after that. Unlike the Pulsar LSW, the SVA-88 has access to high velocity ammo. However, this is not really a massive advantage for two main reasons. And the first is that the SVA-88 already has outstanding bullet velocity, and the increase that it actually gets from HVA is especially low. The second reason is that LMGs with this damage model only drop one tier over their entire fall-off distance, unlike, say, carbines where high velocity ammo grants more of a substantial boon to your mid-range kill potential. So again, not an overwhelming advantage here, and we'll talk more about it later. Both the Pulsar LSW and the SVA-88 fire at 698 rounds per minute, or 11.63 rounds per second. And if you're looking at a purely theoretical time to kill, meaning that all shots land on the chest, bullet travel is instant, and your target isn't running nanoweave, then you'd end up with about a 0.52 second time to kill within your 7-shot kill range, and a 0.61 second time to kill within your 8-shot kill range. That's a pretty quick time to kill, all things considered, and it's just a tier below the Orion or the Beetlejuice, which have a time to kill of 0.48 seconds. Both your Pulsar LSW and your SVA-88 have 75 rounds per magazine, with 225 in reserve. The Pulsar LSW reloads in 3.09 seconds short and 3.9 seconds long, while the SVA-88 reloads in 3.38 seconds short and 4.7 seconds long. So the difference between them is 0.8 seconds for the long reload and 0.29 seconds for the short reload in favor of the Pulsar LSW. This is not a bad advantage to have, but it can also be misleading because a long reload is slang for when you reload a weapon with a completely empty magazine. The time it takes to reload is literally longer than the short reload, which takes place when you have at least one bullet still in the chamber. In other words, in order to actually make use of the Pulsar LSW's outstanding reload time and its key feature, you have to be completely emptying your magazine in the first place. This is a pretty helpful feature for newer players, but veteran players won't make use of this feature the vast majority of the time. On the Orion, dumping an entire magazine is much more common because you only have 50 rounds and the rate of fire is faster, but 75 rounds per magazine is sort of a sweet spot where most players can drop 2 targets without exhausting an entire magazine. Unfortunately for the Pulsar LSW, it does seem to pay a high price for having this reload advantage, at least compared to its big brother. The Pulsar LSW has a projectile velocity of 620 meters per second, whereas the SVA-88 has a projectile velocity of 630 meters per second. So that's only 10 more, and it's a pretty insignificant difference when looked at by itself. And even though the SVA-88 has access to high velocity ammo, it's still only going to bump that projectile velocity up to 650 meters per second, which is the same bullet velocity as the Parallax bolt-action sniper rifle. Even so, a jump from 630 to 650 is also not something that you're going to notice or care about, especially at the ranges where the weapon is effective. As far as accuracy goes, the numbers are completely different per weapon, but basically, the SVA-88 has slightly better kill potential due to the way the weapon handles recoil. The Pulsar LSW recoils up and to the right, It has a 0.335 vertical recoil on top of a 2.45 first shot recoil multiplier, a horizontal recoil value of 0.2, a horizontal tolerance of 0.8, and a recoil angle anywhere from 14 to 17 degrees. And that's not a good thing. The SVA-88, on the other hand, recoils straight up. It has 0.44 vertical recoil, a 1.75 times first shot recoil multiplier, horizontal recoil from 0.2 to 0.225, and a tolerance of 0.9. And for good measure, a compensator is going to drop your vertical recoil to 0.374, and your total first shot recoil is going to drop from 0.77 down to 0.655. Just to kind of clear some of this up, if we ignore first shot recoil multipliers, here's an example chart that shows where your bullets can land based on the recoil pattern alone, so not even factoring in the cone of fire. The green area represents the horizontal shake coupled with the vertical recoil, and the red area shows where the bullets will possibly land. The SVA-88 doesn't have a recoil angle, and because of that, the vertical recoil remains constant. But since the Pulsar LSW has 3 degrees of variance in its recoil angle, things really get jacked up. I should tell you though that the values here aren't drawn to scale, it's just an example to show how things work. So that's the first problem with the Pulsar LSW's accuracy. The second is that you have really high first shot recoil by comparison, and when you have high first shot recoil, you're going to have a harder time opening with a headshot than you would with other weapons. Basically, the SVA-88 is a better headhunter than the Pulsar LSW, on top of being overall more accurate within its initial burst. This is the biggest flaw with the Pulsar LSW in my personal opinion, and it's just not quite accurate enough to justify the other shortcomings. There are some slight differences from a cone of fire standpoint as well. Both the Pulsar LSW and the SVA-88 have a standing moving cone of fire of 0.4 with a bloom of 0.05. Every VS LMG shares these stats, save for the harder hitting Flare and Ursa. The hipfire cone of fire, however, is slightly better on the SVA-88 than it is on the Pulsar LSW. Not nearly as good as the Orions, but it is still better than the LSW. That's a moving hipfire cone of fire of 3.75 for the LSW and 3.5 for the SVA-88, both with a 0.1 bloom. Now the last thing to note about these weapons before we get into the attachment options is that the SVA-88 has a 0.75 times movement speed multiplier while aiming down sights, and that's a feature that's only shared with your Orion and your Beetlejuice LMGs. This is the SVA-88's primary advantage over the Pulsar LSW. The SVA-88 can carry what's basically a perk found on closer range weaponry well into the mid-ranges, and that's important because when it comes to avoiding shots or throwing off your enemy's aim, small movements left or right become increasingly pronounced the further away you are from your attacker, so being able to strafe more quickly is a great benefit. That said, let's get into the attachment options. So both the Pulsar LSW and the SVA-88 share scopes 1x through 4x, including night vision, a suppressor, a forward grip, a laser sight, and a flashlight. On top of that list, the Pulsar LSW also has access to a flash suppressor, while the SVA-88 has access to a compensator, high velocity ammo, and a 6x scope for good measure. For scope selection on either weapon, I'm partial to the 1x or 2x reflex. For the SVA-88 though, I also use the IRNV a good deal, thanks to the mobility advantage while aiming down sights. Outside of that, the most solid setups for these weapons are the forward grip and compensator when it's applicable. That's it. I say solid because the biggest downside to each weapon is, in fact, their accuracy. It's passable, don't get me wrong, but if you've been using something like the Polaris or the Ursa or the NS-15M, you'll start to realize just how much you've lost. To build on that, I'd stay away from the flash suppressor on the Pulsar, again to emphasize the accuracy, and the standard suppressor will gimp your bullet velocity by 40%, basically forcing you to operate within an 8-shot kill range at all times. It's not the worst thing in the world statistically, but the smarter decision would just be to use a close quarters weapon if you have your heart set on a suppressed weapon. For rail attachments, again, forward grip is the obvious choice, but the laser sight isn't totally invalid either. Laser sights will lower your hipfire cone of fire by 33%, and even if you think to yourself that you're never going to hipfire the weapon anyway, you also have to consider whether or not the advantage you're getting from a forward grip is actually worthwhile. Forward grips will increase your LMG's equip time by 0.15 seconds, and these particular LMGs take 0.9 seconds to equip by default. On the Pulsar LSW, I think that a forward grip is still the smartest decision, but the SVA-88 gets a little bit more leniency thanks to its smaller cone of fire, and even if you slap a compensator on it, a laser sight is still going to lower your hipfire cone of fire below where it started. That's a 20% increase for the compensator versus a 33% reduction for the laser sight. The last thing to take into consideration is high velocity ammo. On the SVA-88, the numbers just don't make sense. Equipping high velocity ammo is going to increase your vertical recoil by 10%, which is the downside, the big downside. It'll increase your bullet velocity by 20 meters per second, and it will lower your damage degradation by about 0.05 damage per meter. So that's not a lot. That's nothing. And in case you're curious, you lose 18 damage over 55 meters without high velocity ammo, and 18 damage over 65 meters with high velocity ammo. The difference is truly insignificant compared to the increase in recoil. Don't run HVA on the SVA-88. That said, we're going to run through some weapon-specific strategy before we wrap things up. Regardless of which weapon you're using, your effective range stops around 30 to 40 meters, and 20 meters is optimal. Anywhere before that, you're going to start being outclassed by higher rate of fire weapons. Secondly, you want to choose when to reload. And a lot of people reload out of habit, including myself, but with a 75 round magazine, you have a little bit more say in when you should be reloading and when you should take a quick peek around the corner before you get started. That being said, you want to stay within your short reload, especially with the SVA-88, or you're going to be punished a great deal for it. Specifically for the Pulsar LSW, you want to aim for the chest and then let the weapon kick up into the head area, and then compensate for the recoil by dragging down into the left. A forward grip is going to give you more of a vertical pattern, but the right pull will still be there. Keeping the weapon pointed at center mass is obviously a much safer option than trying to risk the headshots. SVA-88 on the other hand is a little bit different in that you can aim for the neck or the head and then drag straight down into the chest area. Opening with a headshot is not only possible, but it's also very desirable on this weapon. A fun fact worth mentioning is that if you look at the Oracle of Death stats, which I've linked in the video description, you'll actually see that the SVA-88 has consistently higher headshot percentages than the Pulsar LSW, among many other things. Also, for the SVA-88, you want to strafe like you mean it. Remember that you have a 0.75 times movement speed multiplier while aiming down sights instead of the 50% that the Pulsar and most other weapons have to deal with. That means that you can dodge left or right much more easily, allowing you to throw off your opponent's aim. So nothing overly complex as far as the techniques go. But overall, just to wrap things up, if you ever have to make a choice between the Pulsar LSW and the SVA-88, the SVA-88 is going to win every single time. If you look at the score per minute, or the headshot accuracy, or the kills per unique player, or even the battle ranks of the players who use these weapons, you'll notice that the averages for each of those categories is always higher while using the SVA-88. The evidence all points to the Pulsar LSW just being something that's picked up by lower level players because of the cost, and then quickly outgrown and replaced. I don't think that this is necessarily a bad thing because, like I said, it's cheap, it has a great long reload time, which is excellent for newer players who want something that's not the Orion, and if that player sounds like you, then go ahead and buy it. But it's also a bit lacking as a weapon. In fact, I feel like the Pulsar LSW is balanced around its lower cert cost, deliberately made inferior because of it. And I think that's kind of strange because that's not how weapons in this game should be balanced. And hopefully I'm wrong, and it's just that the formula is a little bit off, or that the weapon has just been neglected for a long time and is in need of a rebalance. But there's really only one or two things that you need to do to actually balance the weapon and make it a more consistent tool for newer players and veterans alike. And that would be, just in my personal opinion, to remove the recoil variance or to lower the first shot recoil multiplier substantially. That's it. Honestly, the Pulsar LSW has the makings of a really good weapon, but it just doesn't follow through. If this video has been interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the channel, and if you have some thoughts on the Pulsar LSW or the SVA-88, or even how they compare to one another, then share that. And if you haven't gotten a chance to use either of these weapons yet, then feel free to let me know which weapons you'd like to see reviewed in the near future. Thanks very much, folks. Wrel signing off.